My Lords, I did something very controversial during the EU referendum campaign. I went against my own party's Remain position. I campaigned to leave the EU because the EU is a top-down project designed to promote endless industrial development and economic growth. It remains my strongly held personal belief that we can have a greener, fairer, healthier country by leaving the European Union. In taking this view, I feel a strong personal responsibility to Greens everywhere and to the country to do what I can to ensure that Brexit is a success for the environment. I still want to leave the EU, but I absolutely cannot support this bill as it stands. The Constitution Committee, as we've heard, has described the bill as being fundamentally flawed from a constitutional perspective in multiple ways, but the bill is fundamentally flawed from an environmental and social perspective too. It remains government policy that through Brexit we'll strengthen our democracy, protecting and enhancing environmental and social laws in the process. But in its current form, this bill will fail on all of those aims, and sadly the gaps in the bill will leave the environment as the biggest casualty. This bill does not do what it was promised it would do. It does not ensure that existing EU law is retained. In fact, it explicitly excludes certain aspects of EU law without any justification. For no clear reason, it drops some fundamental principles of EU law, such as the precautionary principle, which must currently be applied by courts, businesses and governments. Additionally, the bill retains EU law without the accompanying preambles. This misses out, for example, the polluter pays principle from the Environmental Liability Directive and loses the aim of biodiversity conservation from the Habitats Directive. These omissions, therefore, lose crucial interpretive aids for the courts in some obscure attempt to squash a square into a round hole as we bring the body of EU law into the literal system of EU law. I struggle to understand how the courts will continue to apply retained EU law when these essential principles are gutted from our jurisprudence. Indeed, senior judges have expressed the need for Parliament to make this as clear as possible. We're setting ourselves up for decades of legal chaos while we needlessly undermine our environmental and social protections. Now, I'm warmed by the many promises that this government is making about ambitions for the environment and their pledges to bring forward legislation. But I note a very deliberate change of tack in the government's approach to this bill. No longer is the bill seeking to retain all EU law and bring everything into order to prepare for Brexit. The government are now saying that a whole raft of other bills are the correct place for retaining some of these really important parts of EU law. It's a promise of jam tomorrow, which we more or less do not accept. I suspect this repositioning is a government tactic to avoid some very important amendments being made to this bill while passing through scrutiny. There may well be better pieces of legislation in the future in which we can establish the lasting legal frameworks that will define our post-Brexit lives. But we only have the bill that's before us now, and we cannot allow deficiencies in this bill to prevail in the hope that some future bill may come and address them. We must amend and repair this bill so that it's fit for purpose, and I very much hope there's sufficient will in this House for that to happen. I want to speak on two issues in particular. On animal sentience, there's been a surprising amount of public support for a rather technical sounding principle of animal sentience, but we're a nation of animal lovers who in our hearts understand that living creatures deserve respect, care, and for humans to avoid giving them suffering as far as possible. The government's attempt to try and head off amendments to this bill in the Commons has been to publish a draft bill recognising animal sentience, but it's achieving the opposite of their intention by setting out a perfect example of how government could well fail to replace EU law with equivalent provisions. A legal opinion commissioned by the Friends of the Earth has compared the provisions of the draft bill with Article 13 on the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU. Article 13 requires the state and its bodies to pay full regard to animal welfare. It has very narrowly limited set of permitted exemptions. Contrast this with the draft Animal Welfare Bill, which only requires government ministers to pay regard to animal welfare against other matters of public interest. This makes the relevant considerations a matter of fact to be assessed by the decision maker, subject only to the relevant legal tests of irrationality. So animal sentience and animal welfare is an ongoing example of where the Withdrawal Bill fails to bring EU law across into domestic law, and where the government's proposed alternative legislation fails to give the same degree of protection that currently exists in EU law. Far from setting a gold standard, it's a significant undermining of the current position. Accordingly, this makes me quite sceptical that the government will be able to protect and improve on EU law and other bills. It seems incumbent on us to fix whatever deficiencies exist in this bill now, so that we can be sure when it goes to the other place that they will have a good bill to comment on. The second issue I'd like to mention is the Henry VIII powers contained in the bill. The reports of the Constitutional Committee have done a fantastic job of setting out these issues, and I'm sure there are many learned members of this House who are going to cover the detail of the constitutional implications, so I will focus on the principles that are at stake. The government is giving itself some very broad powers, and these are powers that could even be used to grant themselves more powers. I know that many civil liberties organisations are very concerned about human rights. For example, Stonewall would like a clear commitment that LGBT people's hard-won rights will be protected. I want to be constructive. I remain supportive of leaving the EU, but the bill before us is the wrong way to go about it. I'm confident that the collective wisdom in your Lordship's House will bring this bill into a much more palatable form, but as it currently stands, I cannot possibly vote for it.